Now, some people like ads, some people don't, and that's okay. But we like to keep everyone happy. So if you're one of the people who doesn't like to listen to ads, choose the David McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts, and you can listen to this podcast just the way you like it.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time. It is high summer. It is high summer, John. And this podcast is going to be a continuation of our European tour, John. But we're going to go to Poland. And there's a variety of reasons we're going to go to Poland. Fascinating, huge country. But maybe one of the things that's always interested me was the fact that since 2001, 2002, Ireland has received in probably more Polish immigrants per head than any other country in the world.
Yeah. With the stonewashed jeans.
The stonewashed jeans, exactly. And at the peak, just after the Celtic Tiger boom, because the Poles were involved in the building trade in the main. And there was actually even a character in the French election called the Polish plumber, because the French didn't allow. It's an amazing thing. Ireland, Britain, and Sweden were the only three countries that allowed Polish people to travel and work without visas.
Yes.
Right? In the beginning, Germany and France didn't allow Poles to work, even though they were in the European Union, because they were afraid of the impact on tradesmen in particular of Polish tradesmen coming over.
Was that not going against the EU agreement?
It was a caveat that France and Germany sought to insert because of the fact that Poland was a country of 38 million and Polish immigration could have an adverse effect on the wages of tradesmen. Whereas in Ireland, we were in the middle of that building boom and we just needed workers. So we absorbed them in. So, for example, even today, John, right? Even today, 17% of the population of Mill Street, which is in North Cork, are Polish. That's 1 in 5. And the other thing about Ireland is that the way in which the Poles settled is they settled all over the country. So they didn't just settle just in Dublin. Yeah. So what you find is large Polish communities. If you really want to know where there's a Polish community, you have to look somewhere. There's the Polski Sklep. You know, the shop.
Yes.
They're selling
Absolutely.
their Polish sauce. So all over the country in Ireland, there are Polish people. And yet we don't know that much about the country itself, about Poland.
That's true.
And again, you know, maybe we should, I've always thought that all these immigrants come into Ireland, their greatest value to Ireland as a nation, as an economy, are their networks in the places they came from. Because the hardest thing to do is to do business in a country where you don't know the culture.
Yeah.
Whereas in Ireland, we have so many Poles, we've so many Romanians, we've so many Spaniards, as we talked about last week, we've so many Italians. We should be able to, or the state should realize that this is part of our human capital. This is part of our network. And you know, one thing that struck me, not only could we, or should we regard these immigrants as actually salespeople, say an Irish sales force selling Irish products abroad, but also culturally, I've always thought, why don't we just give an option in school to learn Polish? Employ Polish primary teachers, right? There must be loads of them. There must be loads of them.
But that's a brilliant opportunity for us, because, you know, we are notoriously crap at languages. It's embarrassing, actually.
It is embarrassing. And kids learn languages from other kids. That's what you notice, right? Yeah. So if you're in a school, I don't know, in Dunmanway in Cork or in Kerry or in Galway, and there's a whole lot of Polish kids who are speaking Polish at home, right? You know, give Irish people the chance to realize that there is a world out there, and learning languages is part of a process of cultural assimilation. And nobody ever lost out by learning a language. In fact, there's an incredible amount of studies, scientific studies, that kids that are bilingual, right, are able to absorb all sorts of other information much quicker. Because there's pathways formed in their heads, there's synapses kicking up in their heads that actually allow them to absorb all sorts. So, you know, that idea, you know, I always think that, you know, we're kind of static in the face of immigration, right? And you've got to see immigration is an opportunity to do all sorts of things. And learning languages is one. And speaking of learning languages, John, speaking of learning languages, as these last few podcasts have been an Irish person's tour around Europe, we're going all over the place and we're thinking about languages and culture and assimilation and all sorts of good stuff. There was a great example last week of Ronan O'Gara's team talk to La Rochelle en français, mais avec un accent très corkois. How do you say Cork people in French? Corkoise. C'est incroyable. C'est incroyable. Écoute ça. Listen to it.
Si c'était Lyon ou Bordeaux, je m'en fucking fous. On joue Bordeaux, samedi, c'est comme ça. À Dublin, à The Outsiders. Samedi, on va favorites. Mais ton humeur, ton performance, c'est dicté par le mec à l'extérieur ou c'est dicté par ici. Il y a tellement de choses de progresser dans cette équipe, je m'en fucking fous d'adversaire, c'est ici. Est-ce que vous avez faim ou vous êtes intéressé de progresser ou on va fucking prendre vacances samedi? C'est pas possible ça. L'opportunité c'est fucking énorme, mais on commence aujourd'hui à zéro. On va créer l'énergie, l'état d'esprit, le sacrifice, toutes les choses on aimerait faire.
Man, just trips off his tongue.
So Ronan, I'm telling you, Intercert French, Leaving Cert French, it was a bit like, John, I bet you your French oral was a bit like that.
Oh, totally. I'm on the Duolingo at the moment, by the way.
Are you?
I am learning French.
I'm telling you.
I've just got the accent bit. I have to work on the words.
Well, you know, it's funny you think about the accent, and this is going out to Ronan O'Gara. When I was learning French years ago, I went to college in Belgium, and the actual master's was half in French and half in English. And my French was really bad. I didn't even do French for my leaving cert. I did Latin instead, which is a ridiculous thing, right? But somebody told me, and it was a really good piece of advice, if you want to learn French and if you want to speak French, do exactly what you're doing there, John. Exacerbate, amplify the Frenchness, overpronounce everything excessively. So you sound like Inspector Clouseau, right? If that's the objective. And they said it actually works, and it does. So, what you do is you try to actually envelop yourself in all things French. And you sound extremely like that.
Yes, yeah.
And ça marche. Ça marche.
Well, back in, was it 91 or whatever, I spent a summer in France, in Clermont-Ferrand, recording an album, and I had no word of French when I started. And by the end of the album, like two months later or 2.5 months later, I was talking high technical stuff in French. Oh my God, I was amazing. But I was just immersed in the whole thing.
Well, no, it's true. It does get you. Well, listen, actually, I want to go back to John's summer in Clermont another time, okay?
Yes.
In Le Massif Central. Okay, but let us go. So listen, Rog, thank you very much for that. That was impressive. Unfortunately, it was a team talk for La Rochelle, who obviously kicked 7 shades out of Leinster at the very end last year. So we best forgotten that. And I'm sure a Munster man like Rog was, it was a double victory for him. It was a double victory. Now, let us go. This week we're talking Poland, John. And a couple of weeks ago, I went to Poland. You remember this, on my way to Kiev in May. And what I did in Poland was, the way this idea that I like doing is I like going, if I arrive in my own in a city, going on cultural tours. And I went on a tour. If you're ever in Warsaw, there's a website called withlocals.com, which is basically an off the beaten track tour, right? So you're not going to see, the Warsaw Ghetto is very, very impressive, and the Old Town is very, very impressive. But this was actually, a slightly different tour. There's a guy called Marcin. It's called withlocals.com if you're ever actually over that neck of the woods. And it was a tour of Praga, which is a sort of a newish suburb, a sort of 19th century suburb. Fascinating story. So I got really deeply into Polish history for about 3.5 hours, which now I've decided I'm an expert. But then of course I got the train to Krakow.
There.
Exactly. I got a high-speed train to Krakow, okay, number one. And I thought, wow, this country, And then I got the train onto a place that's impronounceable, I think, called Przemyśl. But luckily, our next guest will be able to pronounce it. Because many years ago, as you know, I worked in the emerging markets neck of the woods for that Swiss bank UBS. And it was like a sort of a circus of all sorts of oddbods thrown together, people with very eclectic interests in the world, people who could speak Slavic languages better than they could speak their own, all that sort of bizarre thing, right? Yeah. All sorts of different refugees from all sorts of different places. And one of the lads who rocked up was an East European devotee, obsessive expert, James Oates, a Scotsman. And he turns up, and of course we kill it off like that, because the Irish and Scottish thing straight away. James now lives in Tallinn, but is on the board of a number of companies in Poland, knows Poland back to front, has been stomping around that world for at least 20, maybe 35 years, it's fair to say, James, is it? And it's great to see you. How are you, James?
I'm not so bad there, David. Yeah, it's a good 35 years, and it's Przemyśl, so you know.
Przemysl is the name of the town.
Przemysl, yeah. I mean, and if you think that French needs a wee bit of an accent, yeah, Polish has the same problem. And you basically need to go pship, 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 and that'll work it out.
John, you might remember James, who was at our wedding. Not our wedding, John, you and me. Me and Shah.
The only man in the kilt.
The only man
in Roundstone. That's it.
Yeah. The only man in the kilt. James, let's talk about Poland, right? An extraordinary country. Give us a little bit of the history in the sense that the Poland we know today geographically is not what Poland was 100 years ago.
Well, that's right. I mean, I once went to an old museum in London run by the government in exile, and the captain who was showing us around the exhibit said, you have to understand that Poland has not really got foundations. It's built on roller skates. So it kind of moves, around, and it does. And, it's been as far east as Moscow, more or less as far west as it is now. So it has moved around a lot. And in particular in the 20th century, first of all, it disappeared completely after the partitions of Poland in 1795. And so there was what the Poles called the Three Kingdoms. It wasn't a Polish kingdom. There was an Austrian Empire, Prussian kingdom, and a Russian Empire. And actually, the weird thing is you can still see the borders today. So it was divided up, and then it had to come back together again. And it was quite a multinational place. I mean, you got people who came from what is now Ukraine, who were extremely Polish, but they were all chucked out in 1945, every last one of them. And they went to what was Germany. So cities like Danzig or Stettin or Breslau suddenly became, well, once again, in the view of some 1,000 years of Polish history, Szczecin, Wrocław, Gdańsk. And so they literally brought with them the statues from the cities that they were expelled from, which is what we now call Lviv or Vilnius. So these are big Polish populations, so they moved around a lot. And Poland was a multinational country, and now it isn't. It's a massively, completely Polish country. Now, some of that is to do with the fact that, the very large Jewish community was murdered. But also, the Germans were expelled, and the Ukrainians were expelled, and the Poles were expelled from Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. So it is a country that moves around a lot.
So what we're talking about is a country that, when geopolitics shifts, Poland shifts.
Yeah.
And it can move west or east. And the Polish people who used to live in Lvov now live in Poznan, or what we used to be called Breslau.
Yeah.
And those German people who used to live there now live in West Germany in the main.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainians who are now living in Lvov, where did they come from?
Well, they came from the countryside around Lviv. So what really happened was that the cities and towns in that area were Polish-speaking, but the country districts weren't. And that's why Stalin decided, that, no, this is going to be Ukraine and Belarus. So it was a massive patchwork, but now it's not. And that's the extraordinary thing about Poland. It's gone from being this sort of very multinational, multilingual, multicultural, and multi-religious also, to being basically Catholic, full stop, and Polish, full stop. And, in a weird way, some of the national questions of Poland mirror those of the Celts, especially of Ireland, because you've got a kind of political struggle that was backed by the church against, in the case of Poland, most of its neighbors. And so you've got a whole wacky history, which is, as you rightly say, it's geopolitically driven. But things have changed quite a lot because Poland is not a small place, as you found out. I mean, it's got, 38 million people. Economically, it's been growing incredibly fast for an amazingly long period of time. So it's gone from being a pretty screwed up place that was still toiling to integrate the different parts of the country from 1945. And it's ended up now with new infrastructure, a whole redesigned economy, and it's really quite a modern place. It's kind of the eastern side of Europe's answer to the tiger.
This is what I want to focus on. Before we do that, before we focus on the economics, I want to talk about the sort of sociology of the place, because those borders have shifted, but people's attitudes remain the same in terms of what was conservative and what was liberal. Explain that to me, because that is kind of fascinating.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can literally see from voting patterns where the old German territories were, because they're the ones that tend to trade with Germany. The population may have come from the east, but they've ended up being more integrated into the west, and they're more dynamic economically. Whereas the eastern side of the country, which is under the control of the more nationalist party, is still, relatively speaking, it's more backward. So the infrastructure that was left behind after the borders moved, it's being integrated and it is being modernized across the board, but you can still see where the boundaries were. I mean, I occasionally drive down there, and there's an area which is now finally being dug up, but you can see where the cobbled stones stop and tarmac begins. That was the old German-Russian border.
Wow.
So it really is an incredible thing. And yeah, the attitudes are on the Western side are, funnily enough, more Western. And that's where the economy's been more dynamic. That doesn't mean that the Eastern side is not dynamic. It's just dynamic in a different way. It's still more agrarian. And of course, the reality is if you live next door to Germany and you're exporting to Germany, you grow faster than if you live next door to Ukraine and you're exporting to Ukraine from Przemysl.
Yeah. Przemysl, where I spent a long time. And actually, I was writing about the interesting thing about in Przemysl, you've got to wait for this train to Kiev. And what really struck me, because it was obviously all Ukrainians, and what struck me about displaced people, there's a lot of absolute trauma and inconvenience seen. But somebody asked me what it's like to be, and I said, the thing that strikes me most about displaced people, I want to talk about Ukrainians in a second, is the waiting. Waiting for trains, waiting for buses, queuing up to get a visa, queuing up to get an entrance visa, queuing up at the passport control. You have no kind of sovereignty over your life. You're dependent on other people like the UNHCR or at the border and everything. And it just struck me that that's one of the things when people are displaced, one of the powers that you lose is that ability to control your own life and control your own world. And I'll talk to you about that in a sec, but let's talk about this dynamic economy. So I arrive in Warsaw, go to bed, wake up. I haven't been to Warsaw for about 25 years.
My God.
And I am in an extraordinarily dynamic city.
Yeah.
So explain to me what's going on in the economy, because it is growing. Because, we have now 130,000 Poles in Ireland. We had at one stage 250,000 Poles in Ireland. Most of them have gone back. Tell me why they're going back. Tell me about the economy they're going back to.
Well, they're going back to an economy that has continued to grow for 27 years. It's never actually been into recession all that time. So the economy is now 6 times larger, nearly 7 times larger than it was in 1990. And that incredible growth rests on the creation of a service sector and modernization of infrastructure and the development of really good up-to-the-minute industry. Now, you talk about the refugees. There are 3 million Ukrainians in Poland right now. I mean, you walk around Poland and you hear Ukrainian or Russian nearly as often as Polish in some places. But they've been able to bring them in. So there's a real determination to support the Ukrainians because their view is, well, that'll be a great opportunity for us when the war is over. But the economy rests on Lech Balcerowicz's, he chose a radical transformation. So what Poland did was they didn't try to do it smoothly. They just basically went straight to a modern economy as quickly as they could. They privatized quickly. They solved a lot of their labor problems quickly. And yeah, quite a lot of the pressure actually that could have come from unemployment was relieved by the fact they all turned up in Britain and Ireland because they were the first countries that allowed the Poles to travel before they joined the EU. And so the combination of the EU, of investment, of a really dynamic investment environment. I mean, when we first went to Warsaw, there were 3 tower blocks. There was the Stalinist wedding cake, the Palace of Art and Culture.
Which is still a gorgeous look. The Dom Kultury, isn't it?
The Pałac Nauki Kultury. And it's got a clock on it now, which it didn't have before. So they modernized this thing. And it had a couple of other things. And, there was the Brigada Mariotski, the guys who stayed in the Marriott Hotel, which is kind of next door. And opposite that, there was the Electron building. So 3 sort of tower blocks. Now, there's probably over 200. I mean, as you saw, you've got something that looks like a Midwest American city, especially because Warsaw's on a flat plain. You can see it for miles. and the incredible numbers of new towers. And that's reflective of a real dynamism that these guys have actually, they know how to work and they're not frightened about work, as I think a lot of people in Britain and Ireland know very well. So they made a wee bit of money in Ireland. They brought it back. They've not just bought houses, they've set up businesses. So there's a real sort of entrepreneurial spirit that the Balcerowicz plan released. And that's why it's so exciting. And it's pretty incredible when you look at the numbers. I mean, as an economist, you'll know that all the numbers are lies. But the truth is...
Well, as I always say, is every statistic has an agenda.
Yeah, and the issue is, of course, you've got now motorways, and they don't lie. You can't interpret whether a motorway is there or not. So you've got, it's noticeable when you cross the country, coming down from the Baltic towards Germany, you've got brand new highways. And then you get to Germany, and they're not brand new. They're kind of twisty and kind of scary. Yep. So they've really jumped a generation in terms of infrastructure, and that's including telephones and internet and everything else. So they've caught up with what Western Europe was doing. And in some places, they've overtaken.
Yeah, well, I mean, it feels like that when you're there. It feels that this is a country that has skipped a generation or two in terms of development.
Yeah,
from where
it needed
it was,
to, though.
I have grainy memories of the imposition of martial law in Poland in 1981, I think it would have been, around Christmas time.
Yeah.
I've also, a lot of Irish people have grainy memories of John Paul II being Polish, and that seemed to be significant at the time that he was Polish. Lech Walesa was also, these are kind of generational memories. But the idea, the country that I visited the other week is extraordinary. And there's one thing that really struck me. One of the themes of the last couple of weeks traveling around Europe has been certain countries have managed to still have substantial cities outside of the capital. And it seems that the Poles have that too. They have, it's not just all Warsaw-centric. They have a lot of
Absolutely
big cities which are very autonomous.
Yes, they are. I mean, it is quite a dynamic environment away from Warsaw. You mentioned Lech Wałęsa, and of course, Wałęsa kind of gave Balcerowicz the mission, should you choose to accept it. He said, I want you to turn fish soup back into an aquarium.
Is that what he said?
That's what he said. And this line has been used a lot. And you see, they broke up the state bank, the Narodowy Bank Polski, the National Bank of Poland, into local banks. So there was a bank in Gdańsk, in Wrocław, in Szczecin, and so on. And the one in Poznan was bought by AIB in the end, Wielkopolski Bank Kredytowy. So
with our tax money. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thanks, Ireland, for that. Yeah, it was great. And the message, though, actually, it worked out pretty well for AIB. I mean, Ireland not so much, but Poland very much so, because the reality was that the growth of these places was really rapid. And so you got people locally who were able to make really quick decisions, and they did. And, you didn't have to muck about. So Poznan particularly ended up as one of the wealthier parts of Poland these days. And it's the home of one of my favorite beers, Lech beer, not named after Wałęsa, but, hey, it's still worth a drink.
And it's only a stone's throw really from Germany. I mean, it's only, 100 kilometers or 50 kilometers probably from Frankfurt and Oder.
Yeah, I mean, you can get there in an hour.
Now, James, let's say, so there's Poland from 1990, let's say, to 2022, February the 24th. And that Poland was a big Central European state in NATO with a well-behaved neighbor called Germany on one side, a slightly complicated relationship with Ukraine on the other, a reasonably well-behaved Russia just over the border again, past Belarus, right? Then on the 28th of February last year, that all changes. And Poland is now at the fulcrum of a European war. Explain how this has changed Poland and will change Poland for at least the next decade or two.
Well, sociology is kind of interesting because when you get 3 million refugees turning up on your doorstep, you can either go kind of negative on that or you can go positive. And Poles have gone really positive. They've welcomed the Ukrainians. They've supported them. Actually, you don't need a visa to cross into Poland. So although it's the usual chaos of borders, the reality
don't worry,
is...
I've done it twice. I've done the 5-hour wait in the bus. Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah, I mean, remember borders. Like, what a thing. So the sociology of Poland is that it was moving in quite a dynamic economic way, but there's also issues in terms of social policy, particularly the church was quite sponsoring of the populist end of the political spectrum.
Explain to me where this comes from, because I don't think, and again, it's one of those things you always see, that if you have economic growth, if you have a higher standard of living, these tend to go together with a cocktail that biases itself towards liberalism, right? And tolerance and openness and all this. The Poles have gone the opposite way. So Catholicism is back. If you thought Catholicism was gone, it's back in a big way. It's very much enmeshed with the ruling party, or the party in power. So explain that, before we talk about Ukraine and geopolitics, explain that sort of conservative, liberal, urban, rural divide in Poland that we see so evident now.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Polish politics kind of mirrors some of the things that you used to see in Ireland, because you don't really have a liberal party as such. You have a kind of social nationalist party, which is the PiS, the current guys. And then you've got a kind of liberal conservative fraction, which is the Civic Platform, which is now forming a little coalition with the Greens and calling itself the Civic Coalition. Now, those are the guys who wrote the original economic plan, and those are the guys who became big heroes in the EU. So Donald Tusk, who was the chairman of the European Council, was the longest serving Prime Minister of the Third Republic, so since 1990. Now he's back, and in the interim, the social conservatives, the nationalists who are in government, have done several things that have created a lot of social tension. And one of which is to really restrict abortion and to be very negative on LGBT rights. The other is that they have actually tried to attack the judiciary and have been somewhat successful in that. So there is a big dispute at the minute between Brussels and Warsaw over how the current government has approached what they want to call judicial reform, and which a lot of people want to call judge nobbling. And in the middle of all of this, suddenly there's a war. So there was a concern, actually, that the nationalists, like many nationalist parties across Europe, were actually closer to Putin than you might want to think. Well, actually, Mateusz Morawiecki, who's the prime minister, has been absolutely on side for Ukraine in most things. I mean, they tried to save their farmers by stopping the import of grain into Poland. That's created a bit of tension. But other than that, I mean, the Polish defense spending is now at 3% and rising rapidly. And the thing is that the Polish army is actually a really good one. I mean, a lot of people have got a bit nervous about the Belarusians flying their helicopters over Polish territory. I'm here to tell you now, if there was anything serious that the Belarusians try, the Poles would be in Minsk in a few days. I mean, the Belarusian army, even with the Wagnerites, isn't going to cause any trouble for the Poles. They comply with everything NATO. They've got really good kit, and they've got a fighting spirit which terrifies you if you actually get amongst them. So you've got a complicated situation in Poland at the minute.
So geopolitically, Poland is now more important than ever. You look at Europe is shifting. There's a whole sense of frontier states up against Russia. Poland is the most powerful one. It's the most populous one. It's the richest one. It's the most technologically advanced one. And in many ways, historically, it's got all the reasons to fight as well, because there ain't no love lost between these two, the Russians and the Poles. And the Russians have done unspeakable things to Polish, particularly middle class, officer class, the Katyn massacre, all that stuff. We know all that, right? But it also has this internal sociological divide between liberals and conservatives, which is real. It also is on a collision course with the EU over what they call judicial reform, or you said judge nobbling. How does it all play out? And you've got 40 million of them. This is not a small country.
No, we're 38, yeah. And the short answer is we're going to find out pretty soon, because we've got the election in October. So in a few months, the opinion polls are really tight. So it's a very tricky situation for the current government. No government in the Third Republic has served more than 2 terms. Now the PiS government is trying for a third one. And, the reality of that, I think, is going to be a very close election. And that's despite the fact that the media is kind of under the control of the PiS at the minute, or at least the state media is. Now, as far as the situation geopolitically is concerned, I mean, Germany and Russia were equal enemies of Poland. So the joke is, so which one do you want to fight first? The answer is always Germany, because it's business before pleasure. So, and there's no question that the Poles and the Balts have been calling the alarm for quite a long time. This invasion did not come out of a clear blue sky. The Poles have been deeply concerned about what's been going on, and so are the Balts. And it's only now, I think, that countries like Germany inside the EU are going, wait a minute. Yeah, you might have been right about that one. And it's caused a lot of confusion in the political classes in Paris and Berlin that Warsaw isn't actually a bunch of nutters. They were right. Because, the temptation is, they're just a bunch of backwoodsmen. And the peace government doesn't help itself. Most of them don't really speak other languages because they're the ones that didn't come to Ireland. So the guys who are challenging to get back power under Donald Tusk again, they could just do it. But, it's going to be quite tricky because you've got the two big blocks, the Civic Platform, and you've got the Justice and Law Party. And the question about who wins it's within 3 points. So it's going to be what coalitions can form.
Extremely tight. It's going to be extremely tight. Now, let's just look at, finally, before we go. So you have Poland and Ukraine, a very strained relationship over many hundreds of years, and a function of that moving borders we start to talk about at the very top. You've Poland and Germany, which has now got a very good relationship, but historically has got a very disastrous relationship. You've Poland and Russia, which has always been a disastrous relationship. It's always been an antagonistic relationship. Poland is now going to become NATO's superpower in Central Europe. And as you said, with an army and a populace that is up for the scrap, if it has to, unlike Germany's, for example. Do you see European sort of spheres of influence just moving increasingly towards Warsaw and away from the Parises of this world over time?
I think that's already happened, don't you? I mean, the reality is that you couldn't get your opinion into the European Council very easily from the East. And now it's almost the first thing that happens when they start to discuss this. You get the European Council and the leaders of different governments. And the first thing is, so what does Kaja Kallas say from Estonia? What does Mateusz Morawiecki from Poland say about this? So at least I think you've got a much more open mindset from the Western parts of the EU. But, at the end of the day, when you're right, then, it would be stupid not to accept that the Poles have made the right decisions. Now, it's going to be interesting because, of course, if the Civic Platform does come back into power, well, I mean, Donald Tusk knows all of the leaders of the EU, and he personally has a political brand which is immensely powerful. That combined with the economic realities of Poland today, the amazing growth, the open economy, the discipline, the focus on getting it right, that puts Poland in a pretty good situation. Now, we don't know how long this war will last. I mean, it's clearly not gone well for Russia, that's for sure. And, ultimately, it's hard to see that Russia ends up with an enhanced power. But I'll tell you one thing, Poland definitely ends up with enhanced power as a result of this.
James, we will leave it there. Great to see you. Thank you so much for that. Great to see you. And I'll see you again soon, hopefully.
Look forward to it very much so.
Another fascinating guest there, Mac.
James is a sweetheart. He's a really interesting man.
Yeah, and what I realised as you were talking there, and something you said at the beginning, is actually how little I know about Poland, about its economy, etc. When you're talking about this great leap forward, as it were, the kind of generational jump. And what I loved was that quote, turning fish soup back into an aquarium. Brilliant.
It's amazing. Well, I think, it's a whole fascinating part of development economics, which is that because of technology allows countries make technological leaps that weren't there in the past. I'll give you an example. You take a country like India, is going to take years and years and years to lay fiber optic cables, to put in a telecom system, all that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then suddenly overnight, because of 5G, they do it straight away. They do it in a totally different technology. So 5G technology allows poor countries to skip 2 or 3 generations of technological and infrastructure investment to go onto a higher growth plane. And this is what we're seeing all over the world, which is, that the old countries, and I'm talking about France and Britain and Germany and the United States, right? The old, very, very wealthy countries I find it very difficult to understand how new countries are coming up so quickly and so fast. And then one of the reasons they're coming up so quickly and so fast is they're actually making technological leaps. Another great example is think about, the Khan Institute, that teaching mathematics on YouTube. This is bringing Harvard graduate level mathematics to anybody who has a internet connection, right? All over the world. So suddenly you're seeing this leaping forward in education. And what the Poles have done is they've leaped forward in technology. So rather than do what a lot of other countries, and it's an extremely, extremely contentious issue, because the Poles went for what they call the short, sharp shock, right? They liberalized everything. And a lot of people will have said they should have done things much slower, because the social cost of liberalizing too quickly after communism was this total destruction of income of a whole generation. Now, what happened to the Poles is they emigrated.
Yes, they had a kind of a safety valve to come here and to go to the UK and work and, and send money back as well.
But what is proven is that it's worked extremely well for them. And I also think what happens is they benefit from scale and size. Size is very, very important. So the similar country in Central and Eastern Europe, if you want to call the whole region that it's a bit liberal, would have been Yugoslavia, which also had about 30 million people, was a huge economy, made all sorts of stuff. But that broke up into its constituent parts. And all these smaller countries in Yugoslavia now have found it very, very difficult to actually put the pieces back together. I think the same as Czechoslovakia, it splits between Czech and Slovak. It takes a while for these countries to find their feet, whereas the Poles always had this coherent Poland. Now, as James said, it was never geographically in the right place. But since 1945, that coherent Poland was one big mass, and that has helped them. But they have done extraordinary things. And when you go there, John, you should go there.
I was there once. I went to Krakow many years ago, which I thought was a fantastic place. But, you're in and out in the weekend, so you don't really get to see it. But what I was going to say, that there is an interesting parallel as well with Ireland, in the same ways we kind of jumped a generation as well.
Absolutely. And not only did we jump a generation, John, but we actually changed our capital, our industrial base completely in one generation.
Yeah.
So we went from being a beer and biscuits economy, right? Basically Guinnesses and Jacobs. They were the two big industries in this country in the 1930s, right? If you think of it, at independence. And then we were faffing around trying to figure things out. And then suddenly it's like, oh, Americans, multinationals, let's do that. That's our trick. And the Poles have done the same thing. And in a way, all that western part of Poland that James is talking about beside Germany basically has become an outsourcing area from German manufacturing. So basically what the Germans have done is they've taken the Polish industrial base, which was always there. And the interesting thing about communist countries is they tended to have very well educated industrial bases, right? And what they've done is the Germans have taken that, capital has gone from Germany to Poland, Polish labor has fused that capital and created goods which they sell back to the Germans. So it's a sort of a virtuous circle all the time. And what James is saying is the eastern part of Poland is more conservative, it's more nationalist, it's beside Ukraine, it's beside Belarus. But what the western side of Poland is doing, it's kind of dragging the eastern side westwards all the time. Yeah. And this sort of conflict at the heart, I mean, again, it should be not unusual for Irish people. Those conflicts that we had in the 80s between religious people and non-religious people, between conservative and liberal, even geographically between urban and rural, young and old, all those sort of fights are sort of playing out in Poland. But what I think James said, and this is the conclusion, is that here we have a country that at one stage had borders that reached as far east as Moscow and as far south. It was all the way down south into the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, right? For many years, it disappeared completely. It then got divided by the Nazis and the Soviets. The country got squeezed in the Second World War. It shifted its axis after the Second World War, and bits of Poland that were in Ukraine became Ukraine, and bits of Germany that were in Poland became Poland. People moved around. It settled itself. It found its feet. And now it's nearly 40 million people smack in the center of Europe. And I don't think Poland will ever be anything other than a major European country from here on in. And that's a big shift.
So if it's a major European country and a growing power within Europe, how's that going to affect the power structure within Europe?
Hugely, John.
Shifting away from France, Germany.
Hugely, hugely. I mean, at the beginning, at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fear on the part of the Western Europeans was that Europe would, and particularly Germany, would tilt towards the east. There's this German expression, Drag nach Osten, which is the drive to the east. And this has always been a difficult part of German history. This is idea that on the one hand, you have the more Slavic orientated Prussian side of Germany, which was totally destroyed in the Second World War. We kind of forget that what was actually destroyed in the Second World War of Germany wasn't the Ruhrland and the Rhineland and the Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg and all those Western areas, right? It was actually the Prussian side. We forget that East Prussia extended all the way out, the way into what is now modern Russia, all the way Kaliningrad, all the way into Ukraine, all those places, right? So that gets destroyed. And there's always this sense that Germany will flip and go more Eastern. And France was very, very worried about that for a long time. And Britain was worried. It has taken the war in Ukraine to make that a reality. That's the interesting thing, that nothing is the same after the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is a European changing moment. As a result of that, what you have now is you have the Baltics and the Scandies are all now in NATO. So they're tied to the hip to Germany and Poland via NATO. You have a situation where the Ukrainians want to join the European Union as quickly as possible. What Putin may well have in effect guaranteed is that the European Union stretches at some stage in the future from Galway to Kharkiv, from Galway to Donbass.
Yes.
In one straight line.
Yeah.
Except for the UK. So you go around the UK, right? Okay. If you think about it. So it's from Galway to Donbass. And as it shifts to the east, geographically, the center of gravity also shifts to the east. And the center of gravity shifts, therefore, from Brussels to Warsaw. And the countries of the East become much more, not dominant, but much more reflective of a pan-European idea. And that's why Western Europeans need to understand the Slav mentality, the Eastern European mentality, what makes these people tick, what their languages are. And I come back to that at the top. We need to learn their culture because their culture is going to be much more significant to us in the next 20 years than we ever thought imaginable. And in Ireland, because we have so many Poles anyway, and Lithuanians and Latvians, they're right beside us. They're our neighbors at this stage. So what we're advocating, John, the podcast is for Intercert Polish, right?
Yeah.
Intercert Polish exams and Intercert Russian exams and, all that. But no, seriously.
Get your Duolingo out. Polish.
Absolutely. We're going to have a test now next week.
Me orals.
Exactly. I'll talk to you later.
Good luck.
Talk to you next week.